Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Rose to New Ceilings podcast, where we tell the stories of amazing women to inspire young girls. And today we have with us a special guest. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, my name is Megan Mackenzie. I'm a professor at Simon Fraser University. It's nice to be here.
It's nice to have you on. Um, Megan, when we took a look at some of your work, it was some of the coolest stuff we had seen to analyze that kind of field. How would you describe the work that you do to someone unfamiliar with your research?
Yeah, well, I would tell someone I'm a feminist scholar. I'm trained in international relations, so I study global politics, and most of my work has focused on trying to help tell different stories about conflict and war and militaries. And overall, the goal of telling different stories is because I'd like to see less conflict. I'd like to see less war. So um, that's a broad umbrella. And within that, I've done work on sort of gender integration into militaries, sexual violence within militaries, what happens after war in terms of female soldiers. So a few different kinds of things, but the common theme is really focusing on gender and conflict and from a feminist perspective.
Yeah, that's super interesting because not a lot of times is feminism considered like an important part when there's like a war zone going on. So, how would you describe the impacts gender can have on war and war can have on gender? What's the relationship there?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there's so many different strands. We know that women are disproportionately impacted by war. They're more likely to be victims of war. They're more likely to be negatively impacted by becoming refugees, for example, or displaced. So if you think of most of the conflicts that are happening right now, there are very specific gendered impacts. And then there's also specific gender specific crimes like sexual violence within war that happens in almost every conflict. So definitely there's almost every element of war. We also know that women are less likely to support military spending and increasing the size of militaries and less likely to support war in general. And we know that when women are part of peace negotiations, those negotiations are more likely to be successful and to last. So it's, pretty much every aspect of conflict from preventing it to understanding how it impacts individuals to how to end it. You really need a gender perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, looking at your work, it's so clear that you're super passionate about what you do, and I really admire that as a youth trying to get into this space. And I'm so curious for you, what first inspired you to start learning about conflict, especially through a feminist lens?
Um, I guess well, when I was studying and doing my PhD, I visited a war zone. I was in Sierra Leone, only 2 years after their 11-year civil war ended. And it just changed everything for me. I saw the impacts of war and it really shaped what I was passionate about. And what was interesting about being in Sierra Leone is that most of what I had learned about that war just became irrelevant. Like most of the focus of understanding war is civilian casualties, different kind of rebel groups, but what it didn't capture, what those mainstream stories of war don't capture is how it impacts people. So when you're in a community that's affected by war, you see individuals who are have amputated limbs or who are homeless, who have mental health issues post conflict, or many buildings with bullet holes. And just the legacy of conflict is so vast. And I guess that just made me think that we really don't understand war, and that most of the stories and the kind of news coverage of war kind of presents it like it's a kind of a strategy or it's a solution. And I don't think captures just how devastating it is.
Yeah, that makes 100% sense. I just want to kind of ask you, you're telling this like your research revolves around having to research these different impacts of war. You've seen firsthand the impacts war has on people, on communities. How do you kind of stay motivated to keep going after seeing tragedy on almost like a daily basis in your role?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and it's something that I revisit all the time. I think many researchers right now, and I mean, probably you as students can feel a little down right now with what's going on in the world. There's so much tragedy, there's so much conflict, there's so many leaders that are making bad decisions, and it definitely can get very difficult to stay motivated. One of the things I did in my own teaching, I teach a course called Feminist Solutions for Ending War, and it really focuses on success stories, evidence of where feminists or activists have done something or come up with different ways to address conflict. And I thought that was helpful for me as a professor, and I think it's helpful for my students. So sometimes I try and sort of think of solution-based um, teaching and research just to remind myself that things do change. Sometimes we can really get down about how depressing the world is, or evidence that it's not changing, but there are really amazing things happening in the world, and sometimes it takes time and you have two steps forward, one step back. But yeah, I do that. I mean, I also sometimes just shut the news off like everybody else and take breaks. And I wrote about sexual violence in war, and I really had to take a break from that topic for a while. It's just very difficult research, and so sometimes it's okay, I think, to take a step back as well.
Yeah, I think that's super important to know, like in this day and age too. But I love that you're teaching a course that does highlight these feminists who have created a lot of impact, because that's almost what we try to do on this podcast. We try to show some like the brighter sides of feminism, like these people in industries who are creating change. So I'm wondering, is there anything from your research, from your findings that kind of shows that step forward that we're taking?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much amazing work being done. So there's so much amazing feminist organizing. If you think about the conflict and the genocide happening in Gaza and what's going on in Israel, Palestine, it's so difficult to even talk about it and so sensitive. And I know feminists who are organizing across the national borders, and Israeli feminists who are working with Palestinian feminists to really understand each other and to push forward. And I think it's just such an amazing example of solidarity. I think there's amazing research being done on, as I mentioned earlier, peace agreements, and how if we can get women to the negotiation table when it comes time to making peace agreements, how successful those are. I think we have seen change around sexual violence in war. We now understand that problem more. When you think about sexual violence within national militaries, which is a huge problem, even 10 years ago, it wasn't something that national militaries even collected good data on. So we've had, that problem hasn't been solved, but the needle has really been pushed in terms of, paying attention to these issues and, commitments to address these problems.
Mhm.
Um,
Uh,
we've talked a lot about, the kind of research you've done on the women in these communities who have been impacted by war. But we've also kind of taken a look at some of your research on women in the military. Could you maybe talk about some of those patterns in behavior that you've noticed there?
Yeah, so it's an interesting topic to focus on women in the military. I'm someone who doesn't want militaries or would like to see less militaries, would like to see a world where we don't need militaries to advance national security. But at the same time, for those women who choose that as their job, I think it's important, even as feminists who want less militaries, to really advocate and to commit themselves to making sure that that's a safe place for women and men and all genders to work. And so we know historically that women have been excluded from certain roles like combat based on assumptions about their physicality, or assumptions about whether they're as lethal as men, or whether men can trust them. And most of those are just stereotypes and not grounded in research. So there's lots of stereotypes around women in the military. And you see that becoming an issue with President Trump. Like he's very, I think, keen to roll back some of the advancements in terms of integrating women into the military. We just had today Trump, the his efforts to remove transgender service members have been advanced. So he's really interested in making the military mostly male. And that's because it sort of upholds this idea of like what men should be doing, what women should be doing, which is really based in stereotypes.
How do you find your research processes kind of have had to change, considering that so much of your research has these moving parts with these politicians changing things almost every day, with the women being in these war zones, dealing with different situations every day? How do you kind of research that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And sometimes I am choosing to focus on a topic that is changing rapidly. Um, I think I mean, there's always room to adapt, and I definitely have done that. For example, I was planning to be finished on a project on where I did interviews with the first women to integrate into infantry roles in the U.S. And I thought, that research was a little bit just done. And now that Trump is kind of focused on undermining women, and I feel more compelled to revisit that research and really tell those stories in a different way. So, yeah, I think it's just important to pivot sometimes and just stay curious. And that's what I love about my job.
So yeah, I have a question in regards of just how accomplished you are. Megan, you are a very accomplished individual. You're a professor. You've had countless research done. I was just wondering if there was anything that kind of acted as a catalyst in your career to get you to where you are today.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. You know what? There's lots of other amazing women who have helped me and become, really important mentors, and I try and pay that forward. Um, I came from a smaller community. I didn't have any professors in my family, and I had a lot of imposter syndrome when I was first starting out, which I think is very common for young women in particular. And I had women who vouched for me and encouraged me and inspired me. So I think this is an amazing thing you're doing with this podcast, because I do think sometimes women can sort of talk themselves out of something that they don't feel that they can do, or they're worried, or it's not traditional. And certainly I've had discouragement too. And I've had my share of failures and having to learn things the hard way. But I think it's really just, I feel so passionate about the work I do. And there were enough women ahead of me that helped me, that was really helpful.
That's amazing. With just following this idea of, having these women in front of you who can like kind of motivate you and spur you on, I'm just wondering, this field that you study, this feminist perspective on war, how is this field growing? Is this something that people are getting more and more interested in, considering how the world is moving now?
Yeah, I think so. I think definitely I think students are really interested in it. I think students understand that gender matters. Like they experience it every day. You cannot, you cannot avoid it. It doesn't really matter. The only people who sometimes think gender doesn't matter is those who are most privileged. So sometimes, if you're thinking gender doesn't matter, it's usually because you're the one who's in the most privileged position, and often that's men and in a more senior position. So most of us understand that gender matters, and many of us are interested in understanding how to end conflict and why war matters. So I do think it's a growing area. I think I certainly see more students interested in it, and kind of, almost a light bulb going on, and when maybe they didn't necessarily think about, women in peace agreements, or sexual violence in war. Some of these issues wasn't at the forefront because it's not necessarily covered in the news. But I do think it's growing. I also think there's a backlash, globally around anti-feminism, rolling back policies, and so I think it kind of there's both, right? There's resistance and rollback, but I think there's also still quite a lot of committed feminist scholars.
Absolutely. There are so many amazing feminist scholars, and I, we're happy to meet one. And earlier you mentioned that feeling of imposter syndrome, even when working towards these goals. And I was just wondering, taking that step from local to global action, especially, there must have been that feeling of feeling so small compared to this giant issue that I think a lot of youth face nowadays as well. And I'm so
Yeah.
curious, how did you handle that, taking it from local to global?
Yeah, I think students and myself, I mean, we can get overwhelmed by the scope of a problem, and it just feels like any kind of way you might approach it is going to be inadequate. And then there's also, you might be interested in a particular issue and then realize, oh, well, there's also these other issues that are important, and is this the most important issue? And I still feel that in my research. I think for me, I try and sort of stay committed. Okay, what is the question, or what is the sort of thing I'm trying to explore that I think will shed new light on conflict, or shed new light on this issue that may kind of, shift the needle. And it doesn't have to be the most important issue or the most important step, but it's the thing that you're working on. So I guess I try and sort of keep things in perspective. For example, my work in Sierra Leone, I mean, I had never been to Africa before, and I went to Sierra Leone. I was completely unprepared and really out of my depth when it came to doing that research. And I interviewed women there who had participated in the conflict, and I was really overwhelmed by the interviews and the information that I gathered. And in the end, I sort of decided, look, I told these women I would tell their story. I made a promise to them, and that really helped me to stay motivated. And it's like, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to change the world, but I had this question, these people offered their time, and so there's kind of keeping it focused, I think, could be really helpful, because if you just sort of look at all the world's problems and all the possibilities, you can really talk yourself out of everything.
No, that makes a lot of sense for sure. I just want to say, for the audience, sometimes, in whatever's happening right now, going into academia could seem a little scary. Going into studying gender, studying politics could seem a little scary right now. So do you have any advice for the girls who are contemplating whether or not it's still worth it to go and study these kind of fields?
Yeah, I think when you're making a choice about career, it's very hard to know whether it's something you want to do, or whether you feel pressure, or whether it's the right choice. And I remember that phase where you're thinking, oh my gosh, do I want to be a lawyer? Is that the right choice? Am I going to make a difference doing that? Or am I going to be the right person? And I think what's the most important thing is to really spend a lot of time thinking about what you want. And if you want to be a hairdresser, and that's fine, and not to talk yourself out of that because you think it's not good enough, or it's not I think there are different pathways for everyone. And if you want to be a NASA scientist, fine, that's great. That's a certain path that you should really work hard on. But also, there's so many different paths, and not to kind of get caught up with what other people, expect of you, or what you think is sort of the right thing to do. And that's really hard at that phase of life, because you sort of have a very specific idea of what success is. And maybe you'll go on and you're super passionate about hair, and you'll end up doing it in movies and have this incredible career. So I think just to have an open mind about what success is going to look like, and do what is feeling great for you, not sort of what the pressure might be from people around.
Do you have any advice for someone who's interested in advocating for these new perspectives that aren't really as prominent in the media?
Yeah, I think if you're interested, there's lots of interesting women's organizations, like the Women's International League for Peace. I'm a co-director of a research network on women, peace, and security. And those kind of networks often have youth teams or youth members that you can kind of get involved, or at least just see the research that's coming out. And just often that can be enough that they'll send out a newsletter and you can kind of keep track of different things that are going on. I think it's just sort of like anything, um, doing a little bit of research to find things that really speak to you and that seem to come from a perspective that works for you. And there are certain news outlets that are better than others as well. So you might find, okay, I need to, follow this a little bit more.
Mhm.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on today, Megan, and sharing your insights with us. To our viewers, her website will be in the description. So if you want to learn more about her work or read her papers, that's where you can find her. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's
Yeah.
great to meet you three.